The police lights lit up my driveway like a crime scene, over a space that legally belonged to me. I stood there watching officers take notes while my neighbor watched from behind her curtains, certain she'd finally won. What she didn't know was that this single phone call would expose years of lies, rule-bending, and quiet abuse of power inside our HOA. Within 24 hours, the same association she thought protected her would turn against her completely. And the reason why still shocks everyone who lives on that street. How does someone go from calling the cops to being erased from the neighborhood overnight? Before any police lights flashed or HOA emails started circulating, life in that neighborhood followed a quiet, predictable rhythm. The kind of place where mornings began with garage doors lifting in unison, where people waved out of habit more than friendship, and where nothing ever seemed urgent enough to argue about. I had lived there long enough to blend into the background. I wasn't a board member, not a rule enforcer, not a problem resident. I was just someone who paid dues on time, kept the lawn trimmed, and used my own driveway without giving it a second thought. The house itself wasn't flashy. It was practical, lived in, and positioned on a corner lot that came with a slightly wider driveway than most. That driveway had always been my small convenience. It made unloading groceries easier, gave visiting family a place to park, and kept my car off the narrow street that the HOA constantly warned everyone about. Parking had never been an issue for me, and until then, no one had ever suggested it should be. The neighborhood ran on rules, but they were the kind people rarely read closely. Most residents only became aware of them when a reminder showed up in the mailbox or an email warning about trash cans left out too long. The HOA liked to present itself as reasonable and community-focused, but beneath that surface was a quiet hierarchy. Certain voices carried more weight. Certain residents seemed immune to scrutiny, and certain complaints, once raised, never really went away. I had noticed her early on, the neighbor who always seemed to be watching. She knew when contractors arrived, when guests stayed too long, when someone's lawn dipped just below acceptable standards. She wasn't loud about it. She didn't confront people directly. She documented. She reported. She smiled at meetings and nodded along while quietly shaping the narrative of what was acceptable in the neighborhood. At first, her presence was easy to ignore. Everyone has someone like that nearby, and most of the time their influence feels harmless. But over time, small patterns emerged. Friendly reminders turned into written notices. Casual concerns became formal complaints. And somehow, the same names kept appearing at the center of every issue. Always someone else, never her. I stayed clear of it all, or at least I thought I did. I kept my distance, focused on work, family, and the routines that made the neighborhood feel stable. I assumed that following the rules meant staying invisible, that as long as I didn't give anyone a reason, I'd be left alone. What I didn't realize was that attention in that neighborhood wasn't always earned. Sometimes it was assigned. The first sign that something was off didn't come from the HOA. It came from a subtle shift in behavior. A pause when I pulled into my driveway, a look that lingered just a second longer than necessary, a sense that something ordinary had suddenly been reclassified as a problem, even though nothing had changed. There was no warning, no conversation, no attempt to clarify anything, just the quiet buildup of tension that happens when someone decides you've crossed an invisible line they never bothered to explain. And in a neighborhood governed by rules, perception often mattered more than reality. Once someone decided you were in the wrong, the system didn't ask many questions, it simply waited for the right moment to act. That moment was closer than I ever expected. What began as a faint sense of unease quickly hardened into something far more tangible. The shift wasn't dramatic at first. It arrived quietly, wrapped in official-looking emails and carefully worded notices that pretended to be neutral while clearly pointing in one direction: my direction. The first message referenced driveway usage concerns. It didn't accuse me of anything outright, it didn't cite a specific violation, it simply suggested that some residents had raised questions about whether my parking habits aligned with community standards. The language was polite, almost friendly, but it carried an unmistakable implication. Someone was watching, and the HOA was listening. I reread the message multiple times, trying to understand what could possibly be wrong. My vehicle fit entirely within my driveway. It didn't block sidewalks or sightlines. It didn't encroach on common property. Nothing about my routine had changed. Yet suddenly, something that had been normal for years was framed as questionable. I responded carefully, explaining that I was using my own driveway exactly as designed. Days passed without a reply. Then another message arrived, this one more formal. It referenced a section of the bylaws that few residents ever thought about, a clause vague enough to be interpreted however the board saw fit. The wording suggested that driveways were subject to aesthetic consistency and community harmony. There was no explanation of how my parked car violated either. Around that time, the atmosphere in the neighborhood began to change. The familiar rhythm felt disrupted. Neighbors who once waved casually now looked away. A few lingered longer than usual when passing my house, their curiosity barely concealed. It felt like a silent judgment had already been passed, even though no one had bothered to explain the charges. Soon, the notices became more frequent. One warned of a potential fine if the issue wasn't resolved. Another reminded me of the HOA's authority to enforce compliance through escalating measures. Each message arrived without context, without evidence, and without any attempt at conversation. It was as if the outcome had already been decided, and the paperwork was simply catching up. I tried to stay calm. I reviewed the bylaws myself, line by line, searching for anything concrete. What I found instead was ambiguity. Rules written broadly enough to empower enforcement, but loosely enough to avoid accountability. The more I read, the clearer it became that interpretation mattered more than facts. And interpretation in that neighborhood often belonged to the same small group. The neighbor I had noticed before seemed to be everywhere now, always outside at just the right moment, always positioned to observe. Her presence felt intentional, almost strategic. It didn't take long to connect the dots. Complaints didn't materialize out of thin air. Someone had to initiate them, someone who believed they had the authority to define what others could do on their own property. The next escalation came without warning. A fine appeared on my account. No explanation beyond a reference number and a deadline. The amount wasn't devastating, but it was symbolic. It was proof that the HOA was willing to act first and justify later. Paying it would be an admission of guilt. Ignoring it would invite further punishment. I challenged it through the proper channels, submitting a formal request for clarification. The response was delayed, vague, and dismissive. The board acknowledged my message but insisted the violation stood. They offered no specifics, no photographs, no measurements, just a reminder that continued non-compliance could result in additional penalties. That's when frustration began to turn into determination. I wasn't being targeted for something I had done. I was being targeted because someone wanted control, and the system allowed it. The fines increased. The language in the notices grew colder. References to legal remedies and enforcement actions started appearing. It was no longer about parking. It was about authority, about setting an example, about reminding residents who truly dictated the rules. I began documenting everything, every email, every notice, Every unexplained charge, I noticed patterns the HOA probably didn't expect anyone to notice. Similar complaints had been filed against other residents in the past, often initiated by the same individual, often resolved quietly after pressure or compliance. Most people gave in. They paid, they adjusted, they moved on. I didn't. The tension spilled beyond paperwork. One afternoon, I returned home to find a warning sticker placed conspicuously near my driveway. It was meant to be seen, meant to embarrass. It framed me as a problem resident, someone disrupting the order of the community. Neighbors slowed their cars as they passed, curiosity turning into quiet judgment. The sense of isolation was suffocating. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, it was shaping perception. And once perception shifted, facts became irrelevant. Then came the final escalation, the moment that transformed a bureaucratic dispute into something far more serious. I parked in my driveway as I always had, nothing different, nothing new. Within minutes, police vehicles appeared at the end of the street, lights flashing, officers stepping out with measured caution. The call had framed the situation as a disturbance, a potential violation requiring immediate attention. Standing there, watching law enforcement assess my property, I felt a mix of disbelief and anger. This had crossed a line. HOA complaints were one thing, involving police over a private driveway was something else entirely. The officers reviewed the situation quickly. There was no violation, no obstruction, no legal issue. The call had been exaggerated, possibly fabricated. They left without taking action, but the damage was already done. The spectacle had been created. The message had been sent. What the caller hadn't anticipated was the scrutiny that followed. Police reports are records, calls are logged, patterns can be traced, and when the HOA learned that law enforcement had been pulled into a baseless complaint tied directly to ongoing internal disputes, questions began to surface. Board members who had previously rubber-stamped fines started asking for documentation. Emails were re-examined. Past complaints were revisited. The same name kept appearing, the same motivations, the same overreach. Within hours, the tone of communication changed. The HOA paused enforcement. They requested meetings. They asked for patience. It was the first time they sounded unsure. The neighborhood felt tense, like it was holding its breath. Rumors spread quietly. People who had kept their distance began reaching out privately, sharing similar experiences they had never formally reported. Stories of intimidation, of selective enforcement, of feeling powerless against someone who knew how to manipulate the system. The dispute was no longer about my driveway. It had become a spotlight, exposing years of unchecked behavior. And as the HOA scrambled to contain the fallout, one thing became increasingly clear. The same authority that had been used to harass could also be used to remove. What no one knew yet was just how fast that reversal would happen, or how complete it would be. The meeting was scheduled with less than 12 hours' notice, and that alone told me everything. This wasn't routine. This wasn't procedural. This was damage control. By the time the HOA board gathered, the atmosphere had shifted completely. What had once been a confident, unchallenged authority now felt brittle, strained under the weight of scrutiny it hadn't prepared for. The police report existed. The call logs existed. The paper trail I had quietly assembled now sat in multiple inboxes, forcing the board to confront something they had avoided for years. Patterns don't lie. The climax didn't arrive with shouting or raised voices. It arrived with silence. The kind of silence that follows the realization that a line has been crossed so clearly it can't be argued away. The HOA began by attempting to reframe the situation. They referenced community harmony, safety concerns, resident anxiety, but each justification collapsed under its own vagueness. The more they tried to explain, the more obvious it became that enforcement had been driven by one individual's persistence rather than any legitimate rule violation. Then, the full scope of the issue surfaced. The police involvement triggered an internal review the board couldn't stop once it began. Calls made to law enforcement over civil matters weren't just embarrassing, they were liabilities, insurance risks, legal risks. And when the board reviewed prior complaints tied to the same source, the pattern was undeniable. The same resident, the same methods, the same escalation tactics, over and over again. What made this moment so explosive wasn't just what she had done to me, it was what she had been doing to the neighborhood quietly, systematically, and without consequence for years. Documentation revealed how often enforcement actions had originated from her reports, how frequently fines followed her complaints without independent verification, how many residents had adjusted their lives simply to avoid becoming her next target. The HOA hadn't just enabled her behavior, it had relied on it, outsourcing enforcement to someone who enjoyed wielding control. The board members weren't unified anymore. Some looked defensive, others looked panicked, a few looked genuinely shocked, as if they were seeing the machinery they'd helped maintain for the first time. Then came the moment no one could undo. The board reviewed the police report in full, not just the summary, but the annotations. The officer's notes made it clear. The call had been exaggerated. The situation had been misrepresented. The driveway had never been an issue. The complaint had been framed to provoke an urgent response. That single document reframed everything. Calling law enforcement under false pretenses wasn't just petty, it was dangerous. It exposed the HOA to serious consequences and shattered any claim that the enforcement actions had been reasonable or proportional. The board's legal counsel intervened immediately, not with reassurance, but with caution, with urgency, with the kind of language that signals a turning point has already occurred. The narrative flipped in real time. I wasn't the liability anymore. She was. What followed was swift and methodical. The HOA suspended all enforcement actions related to my property pending review. Fines were frozen, notices were retracted, and then attention shifted entirely to the source of the chaos. Her history with the HOA was dissected piece by piece, every complaint, every escalation, every moment where the board had deferred to her judgment without verification. What once looked like diligence now looked like obsession. What once felt like community involvement now read as harassment. The most shocking revelation wasn't just how much power she had tried to wield, it was how willingly it had been handed to her. And once that reality set in, the board understood something crucial. If they didn't act decisively, they wouldn't just be complicit, they'd be responsible. The decision didn't come with drama, it came with finality. Her privileges within the HOA were revoked immediately. Access to internal reporting channels was cut off. Pending investigations into misuse of HOA processes were opened. The board cited conduct unbecoming of a resident, abuse of enforcement mechanisms, and actions that endangered community trust. But that wasn't the climax. The climax came when the board reviewed the community bylaws governing residency standards. Buried deep within them was a provision rarely invoked, one designed for extreme cases. It addressed behavior that posed a risk to the association's legal standing or the safety of residents. False police reports qualified. The realization hit like a shockwave. Within that same meeting, the board voted to initiate formal removal proceedings. Not fines, not warnings, removal. The neighborhood that had once felt controlled by her watchful presence was suddenly confronting the reality that she had pushed too far. The system she had manipulated now turned inward, applying the same rigid enforcement she demanded for others. News spread fast, faster than any HOA notice ever had. Residents who had kept their heads down for years finally spoke up. Emails poured in, statements were submitted, accounts of intimidation and selective enforcement filled pages. The HOA couldn't ignore it anymore, even if they wanted to. What made the moment so emotionally charged wasn't revenge, it was vindication layered with disbelief. The same neighborhood that had quietly tolerated her behavior now watched as the consequences unfolded with clinical precision. By the end of the meeting, the outcome was unavoidable. She was barred from participating in HOA activities. Her standing as a resident was formally challenged. Legal steps were set in motion that would remove her from the community entirely if upheld. 24 hours. That's how long it took for her authority to evaporate. The woman who called the police over a driveway was now the subject of the most serious enforcement action the HOA had ever initiated, not because of personal retaliation, but because the truth had finally been documented, undeniable and irreversible. The power dynamic had inverted completely. As the meeting concluded, the neighborhood stood on the edge of something new, relief mixed with shock, quiet satisfaction tangled with unanswered questions, and while the HOA scrambled to repair its image, one thing was certain: the system that had once protected her had just erased her, and what came next would define the community forever. The days that followed felt strangely quiet, as if the neighborhood itself was recovering from a long-held breath. The flashing lights were gone, the warning notices stopped arriving, the steady drip of enforcement emails that had once dictated the rhythm of daily life abruptly ceased. In their place was an unfamiliar calm, the kind that only appears after something deeply disruptive has finally been removed. The HOA moved quickly, not out of confidence, but necessity. Official notices were sent to residents clarifying that recent enforcement actions tied to driveway usage had been invalidated. Fines were reversed, records were amended. Language that once felt threatening was replaced with careful reassurance. The board emphasized transparency, fairness, and a renewed commitment to community trust. It was obvious they were trying to distance themselves from what happened, to reframe the narrative before it hardened into something irreversible. Behind the scenes, the consequences were far more serious. The removal proceedings didn't happen overnight, but their impact was immediate. Her influence vanished. The constant reports stopped. The atmosphere of surveillance that had hovered over the street for years lifted almost instantly. Neighbors who had once altered their routines to avoid scrutiny slowly returned to normal. Cars parked where they always had. Trash cans stayed out an hour longer without panic. Small freedoms, once quietly surrendered, were reclaimed. The HOA itself underwent a visible transformation. Board members resigned. New elections were scheduled. Policies that relied on vague language were flagged for revision. Enforcement procedures were rewritten to require verification, documentation, and multiple points of review. The association couldn't afford another scandal, not legally, not financially, and certainly not reputationally. What surprised many residents was how openly the HOA acknowledged its failure. They admitted they had relied too heavily on a single source, that they had allowed convenience to replace judgment, that they had mistaken persistence for legitimacy. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was a reckoning. As for her, the consequences were absolute. She was no longer welcome at HOA meetings. Her access to internal systems remained permanently revoked. The process to remove her from the neighborhood advanced steadily, fueled by evidence she had unknowingly created. The same meticulous documentation she once used against others now worked against her, painting a picture of sustained harassment and abuse of authority that couldn't be dismissed. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman who tried to control the neighborhood through rules and fear had ultimately been undone by the very structure she believed protected her. The system didn't change overnight, but it did something far more powerful. It corrected itself. For me, the resolution wasn't about victory in the traditional sense. There was no celebration, no sense of triumph that erased what had come before. Instead, there was relief. Relief that I could use my own property without feeling watched. Relief that the threat of arbitrary punishment was gone. Relief that standing my ground had mattered. I didn't become a hero in the neighborhood. I didn't want to. What changed was subtler, but more meaningful. Neighbors began talking again, not in hushed tones or private messages, but openly. Stories emerged of fines paid without understanding why, of warnings issued without explanation, of quiet compliance born from exhaustion rather than agreement. The dispute had given people permission to acknowledge what they had endured. Long-term, the resolution reshaped the community in ways no one could have predicted. The HOA adopted clearer rules, written in plain language. Enforcement became predictable instead of personal. The association's power was still there, but it was constrained by accountability. Residents who once avoided involvement began attending meetings, not to control others, but to ensure transparency. Trust, once broken, doesn't return easily, but slowly it began to rebuild. The driveway itself returned to being just that, a place to park, a convenience, an unremarkable part of daily life. And yet it carried a quiet symbolism. It stood as a reminder of how something ordinary can become a battleground when power is misused, how quickly normal life can be disrupted when systems prioritize authority over fairness. What lingered most wasn't anger, but clarity. I learned that following the rules doesn't always protect you, that staying quiet doesn't guarantee safety, that sometimes attention finds you whether you want it or not. And when it does, the choice isn't whether to comply blindly or fight recklessly, it's whether to document, to understand the system, and to force it to operate as intended. The HOA learned that unchecked power, even when delegated informally, carries real consequences, that enforcement without oversight isn't efficiency, it's liability, that communities don't fracture because of rules, but because of how those rules are applied. And the neighborhood learned something equally important. Silence is often mistaken for consent. The events that unfolded didn't just remove a single disruptive influence, they exposed a vulnerability that exists in many communities, the tendency to let the loudest or most persistent voice define reality. Once that illusion shattered, people realized how much agency they had quietly given away. In the end, the most satisfying outcome wasn't her removal, it was the shift in balance, the realization that systems only become oppressive when people stop questioning them, that accountability isn't confrontation, but clarity, that fairness requires participation, not avoidance. The driveway is still there, the house is still the same, the street looks no different to an outsider. But beneath that surface, something fundamental changed. Power stopped flowing in one direction. And the question that remains isn't about what she did, or even what the HOA allowed. It's this: how many neighborhoods are one phone call away from discovering the same truth?